You are listening to the Living Room Disciple Podcast. We aim to model the discipleship conversations that should be happening on couches and around dining room tables. We're trying to grow our imaginations to think about what could and should be as we follow Jesus. We're asking ourselves questions about how we're being formed more or less like Jesus by the world around us. And we invite you into that conversation. So if you find this episode helpful, make sure to share it with a friend. Also, liking and subscribing, leaving a review, all those things help us grow and get the word out there. So please be sure to do that as well.
On today's episode, we are talking about immigration, but our job is not to convince you to think about it a specific way or to tell you how to vote. Our job today is to ask the question, how have we been formed as we've come to our conclusions? Are we walking in the footsteps of Jesus? And how are we being formed by our beliefs on immigration? Let's talk about it today on this episode of the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home.
All right, Nick, it's pretty safe to say that we are not immigration experts.
And speak for yourself.
Yeah, right. Understanding what a nation state's responsibility is to protect its people, to defend its borders, to maintain the integrity of its internal economy inside of a very complicated world. The ability for mass immigration today is more so than perhaps any other time in human history. And so it creates a lot of complications that past nation states have not had to deal with. That being said, I'm kind of under the conviction that the issue of immigration, just in this moment, so I don't think this is always true, but in this moment, the issue of immigration for me seems like the issue that most confronts, or most directly, most clearly confronts our understanding of what does it mean to live as someone in an already not yet kingdom. You know, as somebody who is in the kingdom of God, but that kingdom is not fully realized yet. And so we are currently operating, for us, me and you, in our context, we're operating in the kingdom of America to some extent. This is the kingdom that we live in. But we live as, in some ways, we're supposed to live as immigrants in this kingdom.
Right.
Because our true citizenry, since the moment of our, depending on your faith background, I may call something different, but our moment of conversion, a moment of salvation, a moment of which we entered into new life, or what Jesus calls in John 3, new birth. After that moment, we enter into new citizenship. And so that, I think it just makes this conversation really difficult and incredibly muddled and incredibly unclear, and yet really important for us to ponder the theme, I think, of all of our political conversations, which is not what we voted exactly, but why we are voting in the way we're voting. What is our heart posture? And I just think of all the topics, this may be one of the most important and complicated, and we're not experts, so God bless us.
Yes. What is our heart posture, and how is my current belief and my current heart posture forming me into the person that I'm becoming? So what is the direction that I'm aiming at because I'm holding this set of beliefs? But I'm intrigued by your opening statement there. I want to hear more about what are you feeling is the tension in between the now and not yet? What is the tension in between kind of seeing the image of God in the other versus protection of those nearby us? And what's the tension that you see?
So, like most of the topics in America today, and globally in many industrialized nations, political climates, we're very quick to extreme polarization. In this case, in this topic, that looks in its most polarized forms, really high levels of maybe what somebody would call open borders. There's very few individuals who are actually advocating for truly open borders, but generally really close to open borders, or an easy pathway to citizenship. And this is where the conversation becomes really complicated for immigrants who are currently living in the United States, who are undocumented or illegal, depending on which political side you're on would
Right.
indicate the language you use there, which is really tough, by the way. I think we haven't talked about this before, but even your language can be used by someone to indicate what they think you think of something. But anyways,
Yeah.
so that's what one side, really easy ways to easy pathways to citizenship, less border security, not no border security. Again, there's very few, if any, politicians advocating for that, but more limited border security with a higher emphasis on providing humanitarian aid to those who are attempting to cross our borders. On the other side would be individuals who desire stronger borders for the sake of protections nationally and economically. And what that means is, I think a lot of times we think about in the most extreme ways the language is used about murderers or dangerous individuals who are crossing the border with an intent to do harm. Again, only the most extreme individuals on that side of the argument really say those kind of things. Generally speaking, we're talking more economic and in some safety, but largely economic purposes, right? If you have a really large portion of undocumented workers like we do in the United States, you can shift the economy. You have individuals who are, to some extent, leveraging or utilizing resources that they are not putting taxpayer dollars towards, and they could be taking roles and positions that some may think would be that would take away from the ability of American citizens to have and leverage, right? So the idea would be that maybe I didn't get that job in that roofing company because there was a crew of undocumented workers that are getting paid much less, and they got the job instead. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those. It's really complicated. But the reason I say that there's such tension is because, one of the things that I've kind of been preaching is that we should really be thinking about what's good for my neighbor when we go to the ballot box.
Yeah. This
becomes really difficult.
Indeed.
Because there's really valid arguments on both sides, right? There's a very good argument that, and I do believe theologically speaking, that every individual on earth is to be considered my neighbor. I think this is the point of Jesus' story about what we call the Good Samaritan. The idea is that the Samaritan is from a different ethnic and national background, and he's the one who provides the support. And so Jesus is making a cross-cultural connection for the Pharisee asking the question to help him understand that your neighbor is this cross-cultural individual. So clearly the immigrant crossing the southern border is my neighbor.
Right.
But also somebody who could be negatively affected by the economic impacts or the physical danger impacts, though that data I think is a lot more mixed. Anyways, but the economic impact that an undocumented worker may have on the economy, well, that could be hurting my neighbor. Right. And this doesn't mean, for the record, as I'm saying this, I'm like already listening. In my own mind, I can hear all the counter arguments from each side. Well, Phil, undocumented workers really help the economy, and here's why. And, there's this reason over here that, the law is the law, and you just shouldn't break the law. And so we as Christians need to advocate for the law. And so if they're undocumented, they're illegal, and they should be punished under the law. And like, I can already hear all the arguments, and to some extent, they're very valid. But this is why it's complicated, I think, maybe even more so than some of the other conversations we've had. Yeah,
absolutely. I think there's a complication there, and it reminds me of our conversation on gun policy, that really when you boil it down, generally speaking, people just want to feel safe. And so I think on the conservative side of the spectrum, I think there are probably people who are not actually affected and whose literal physical neighbors are not actually affected by immigration. And yet they have taken the talking points of their favorite politicians and news channels and the people they follow on Facebook and so on and so forth. And they claim that it's about safety. And so it's really easy for people on the more liberal side to then say they're just bigots, they're just hateful. However, there are absolutely people who have been affected, and when they think about this issue of immigration, their thoughts do not go to, I don't like people from other countries. Their thoughts go to, I don't feel like I can provide for my family, and what's going to happen when there's more and more and more people coming into this country.
Yeah.
And so just trying to, again, offer generous takes on both sides and not inherently demonize somebody because they disagree with us. And I've seen this issue, I've seen the demonization more one way than the other. And I think we should be careful in doing that.
Yeah, I'm wondering. So you just kind of said too. I think one of the things I want to camp out a little bit more than I should want to.
Mm-hmm.
So stop me. But you kind of said I see the demonization more on one side than the other, and I think to some extent I would actually disagree with that in the sense that it seems that if by demonization we mean to indicate that a human is like a demonic entity, which sounds so hyperbolic and yet is absolutely a part of our political rhetoric at the moment.
Yeah, they are evil. Yeah.
So crazy to me. And we need to talk about that in a moment. But anyways, but yeah, I think on the conservative side, there's often the demonization of both those who are trying to cross the border, the assumption that their motives are inherently evil and corrupt, and demonization for those who advocate for that, with an assumption of evil and corrupt collaboration with these evil and corrupt people. But then on the other side, and I think you did a good job hitting this too, there's the assumption that because someone holds a certain viewpoint, in this case, having stronger borders, that, well, by default, they must be a terrible, evil human who wants these women and children at the border to suffer and die. Or they're heartless and they're terrible. And so there's this,
well, I think it's interesting because on one side, the demonization seems to be of people who disagree, whereas on the other side, it might not be so much demonization as dehumanization, literally in some cases calling immigrants animals and criminals and illegals rather than human beings made in the image of God. So it's demonization versus dehumanization.
Oh, I think and we're painting with really broad brushes here.
Of course.
But I think there's a lot of validity there. And I think one of the things I want to make sure that we say, and I know you agree with this, is like, as we're having these conversations, we want to model. I've been thinking a lot about why we are doing the podcast and why we're even having these conversations.
Yeah.
And one of the themes that comes back, it's just coming back to why we started this like almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, whatever it's been. It's all a blur. is we want to model the types of conversations we should be having at home with our kids, with our friends, and our small group, because we're going to talk about politics in these smaller settings. For the most part, a lot of these conversations look like the one person, you know what I'm talking about, they said something and we just kept our mouth shut.
Yeah, nobody else wants to counter them because they don't want what's coming.
Yeah, and for the record, there's total wisdom in that. I'm very much a keep my mouth shut person unless there's like the right setting and the right moment. I speak enough on the podcast. I could just send people episodes if they want to know my thoughts. But no, in all seriousness, we're going to have these conversations. And so we want to model what does it look like to have these conversations and operate in a healthy way. And here's the crux, in my opinion, about the conversations around immigration. There is no space for a believer to begin to indicate that a human is an enemy, spiritually speaking.
Right.
And I just feel frustrated that I feel like this is such a common area in American politics specifically. In American politics, because so much of our politics is interwoven with a facade of Christian faith, people say. But Paul was so clear that we war not against, and he says flesh and blood. And what he's saying is we have no human enemy.
Yeah.
We have no human enemy. But instead, there's these powers and these power, like these spiritual principalities, these powers that are behind the scenes, the physical scenes operating in the spiritual realm. And they are very much the enemy. And then I've been working through Revelations in a Bible study, and I'm reading. Shout out to Scott McKnight reading Revelation for the rest of us. Like a year behind you, Nick. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about like, this is what John's saying. John is using the imagery of Revelation or the imagery that was given to him by Jesus in this Revelation to help paint a picture that humans are not the enemy, but there are these spiritual powers behind these. He calls them Babylon and the dragon, and he gives this all this imagery with it. He's like, these powers are what's behind the scenes. And you know what? We believe this is kind of, in my opinion, like one of the things John's hitting in this Revelation, in the book of Revelation. We believe this so much. Hold on to the faith and die for the faith, not kill somebody else for the faith,
for sure,
right? But to die for the faith, and hold on tightly, really believing that is in the death of the martyrs that we see in part our contribution to the crushing the head of the snake, right? The defeating of the dragon.
Right.
And I think this should be a part of our conversation as we relate to immigration, that it's just impossible, spiritually speaking, in the kingdom that we are living in but not fully in. The kingdom of God, that we are operating as citizens but not fully seeing it lived out here on earth until the coming of Jesus again, that there's just no space in our lives for an immigrant or another citizen to be our enemy.
Right. I absolutely agree. I think, and since this is a spiritual formation conversation, we should talk about what happens when you allow yourself to view a whole group of people as inferior to you, less than you, and even less than human, less than an image bearer. What begins to happen to your soul when you do that? What begins to happen to your relationships when you do that? What begins to happen to your relationship with the God who became flesh and blood? When you give yourself the permission to view other humans as less than you, simply because they either believe differently than you, vote differently than you do, or are from a different country than you are, or have even behaved in a way that you don't agree with by crossing that border, right? But regardless of the motive, what happens to our souls, what happens to our discipleship, what happens to our ability to be conformed to the image of the Son when we view people that should be neighbors to love as enemies, animals, bigots, the list goes on and on. What happens when we don't give them the respect that they deserve as primarily images created to show the world what a good and generous God looks like? That's who our neighbors are. That's who our enemies are. That's who our loved ones are. And that's who the people we vehemently disagree with, that's who they are as well. So I think it's not just an issue of you shouldn't do that, but it's an issue of if you do that, the person you are becoming is not the person that God has called you to be. I see you're looking something up. I'm curious where you're going.
I'm looking for the verse in Revelation.
Yeah.
It's in one of the messages where it talks about Jesus essentially indicating this church is lukewarm. I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were cold or hot. I wish that you were cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich, and I have become wealthy, and I have no need of anything. And you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may become rich, and white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness will not be revealed. And eye salve to apply to your eyes, so that you may see. Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. Therefore be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in to him, and I will dine with him, and he with me. The one who overcomes, I will grant to him to sit with me on my throne, and as I also overcame and sat with my Father on his throne. The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. One of the things we talk about, being an American and being in our culture, being in our nation, like our churches are so wealthy.
Mm.
Our people are so wealthy. Like, I am so wealthy in comparison. And it leads to what I'm starting to learn is spiritual lukewarmness, which is a lack of conviction and power for the obvious truths of the gospel. And I'm starting to see that one of the biggest evidences of lukewarmness is when we become so convinced that our comfort and our protection and our safety is our number one priority. Like that's a luxury. Like, I think we forget the luxury of being able to just advocate for my own, economic best interests and for my rights and for my whatever. And I don't know, like to forget that like the story of the gospel is an individual who came and one way to word it and fought for and advocated for somebody else's undeserved rights.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? Like, I guess I don't even know where I'm going with this exactly, but I'm just thinking about like, I don't know, Nick, like to not be deeply focused on the advocacy for others and making a good world for our neighbor. I don't know how we couldn't think of ourselves as lukewarm. You know what I mean? Like that is like, I'm not doing the basics of the faith, like the basics to love God and to love others. And what other, like that's, if you're not doing that, you're lukewarm.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think to look a suffering person or family or group in the eyes, or to read their story in the news, is probably a more accurate description for most of us. And then to turn away and say anything less than, I hurt for them, and how can I be the hands and feet of God to them in some way, I think is falling down on the job. And it's Matthew 25. Whenever you see somebody who needs a coat or a food to eat or something to drink, and you do not offer it to them, you have not offered it to me. And I think there are a million ways to love our neighbors, and for most of us, there aren't many practical ways to actually be there for immigrants and for people who are especially seeking refuge from violent or oppressive or harmful places to live, for them and their families. I think the call to love your neighbor has to include those people, because like you said, everybody, based on the Good Samaritan, everybody is our neighbor. While at the same time, politics has to play into that equation, absolutely, because there are things I simply can't do as an individual. And so politics and policy plays into that equation. I think one of the flaws in our thinking can often be making it all political. Like, what I'm doing for the least of these is advocating for these policies. And we can actually so distance ourselves from other image bearers and kind of think of ourselves even as better than them, that I have the right to vote for them, so I'm going to do that. So, and we kind of elevate ourselves rather than humbling ourselves and saying, what would I do if I was in that situation, putting ourselves in their shoes and thinking about, what would I do for my children? What would I do for my family? And yeah, it requires a lot of thought, because I think a lot of people with a good heart posture towards this issue still end up approaching it in a way that can be malformative. Whereas other people have, like you said, their own self-interest in mind, or the interests of their own neighborhood in mind, and therefore convince themselves that it's okay to overlook the needs of the suffering and the needy.
And maybe this isn't gonna be like too blunt, but like, and to be really blunt, right? Like, if I'm like to pick apart each side, which ironically I've actually held both political views in my life. And so I'm really talking about the Phils of the past, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, there's this conservative Phil of the past who is really concerned with creating a safe place for me and my family, economically and physically. And that Phil is prioritizing my own individual safety above the above the priorities of my king. Okay.
Right.
And that's really problematic. And that often leads to, we know we're doing that, so we have to begin justifying that.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to a very easy and safe path to the demonization or dehumanization of immigrants, because if they're not really human or if they're evil, then I can justify acts of ungodliness towards them, is how their psyche works. It's how mine works anyway.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side of things, we forget, like, we can hold a moral superiority posture, just like someone who's pro-life may over somebody who's pro-choice. We can hold a moral superiority posture because we may believe that we should have, a better system for taking care of the immigrant, which, for the record, almost everybody agrees that we should do this better, and we should take care of people at the border. We just disagree often in our nation on whether or not that looks like bringing them over to the border quickly, doing that slowly. What are the limits to that? What can we really support? That kind of thing. The actual debates are way more nuanced. But anyways, it's oversimplifying. We can hold a moral superiority ground, and we can dehumanize the people living here, because we forget that oftentimes people have created an image of fear of immigrants because they have their own issues and insecurities.
For sure.
They're usually not like wealthy and secure. They're usually living paycheck to paycheck. And so if we ask ourselves the question, how do we create a safe environment for everyone in this nation? And how do I love my neighbor, right? Then that neighbor might not feel the need to defend themselves. And part of the greatest irony is they're often, and this happens on all number of topics, a lot of data would indicate that people have a very, yes, I want them here, but not in my neighborhood mentality, right?
Yeah.
So in incredibly perhaps liberal areas, especially liberal areas that are also tend to be wealthy, they'll still advocate for local policies that will ensure that those people are not going to have their, they're not going to seek asylum in their, neighborhood, as it were.
Correct.
And what ends up happening is both sides, and this is where I get really angry, actually. Both sides begin to use humans as talking points and pawns.
Yes.
And that culminated in 2022, when two different United States governors actually took image bearers of God, immigrants in their states, and shipped them to different parts, to other, in this case, it was two conservative governors, shipped these people to two liberal states in order to prove a political point, as if human beings, image bearers of God, and as if these people, their value is found in their symbolic representation of their, in this case, of their political views, right? Like I'm going to use these people, these men, women, and children as my I gotcha point. But that was just a physical manifestation of what we've been doing for decades anyways.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Still just throwing around the idea of these image bearers. And I just want to take a moment and just praise the Lord. Churches, I just want to clearly kind of like bring the circle on that story to an end. There were churches in both New York and in Martha's Vineyard where those individuals were transported that provided humanitarian aid, translators, food, shelter. And obviously, I don't know the full extent of that story, but by God's grace, these churches took care of these individuals, at least for a short time, hopefully for a long time. But that being set aside, like what I'm trying to say is individuals, both liberal, conservative, can, without meaning to, I've said this before, I don't think people have they're not twisting their maniacal mustaches. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to, generally speaking, people have good intentions. They believe that these tough border policies are going to create a safer world for everybody, or they believe these open border policies are going to create a safer world for everybody. Generally, people are not evil in that regard, and people are all spiritually evil and corrupt, and in that spiritual way broken. But that brokenness doesn't mean that we're all axe murderers. You know what I mean? Like there's an extent of still goodness and God created imagesness in us that leads to a general pattern of trying to do what's right, but like Paul, failing miserably.
Yeah.
And in order to say, in my opinion, godly, it's not about picking the right policy as it relates to immigration. It's about holding the right heart posture, which must mean looking at everybody involved, political opponent and immigrant, as a child of the King, bearing their image, and with the consciousness that we will stand before our King in judgment, potentially, for how we treated them amongst other things. Jesus said,
Yeah.
This is the story, the parable about, like, when you clothed them, when you fed them, when you did, what I mean? You did it
Sheep
for
and the
me.
goats. Mm-hmm.
And when you didn't do it, you didn't for me. And that's true not just for the immigrant, but for our neighbor,
Right.
who had insecurities and was living paycheck to paycheck and was worried. And so they developed this harsh border policy idea because they want to make sure their kids are taken care of. And we weren't providing for them to help them feel safe and secure in their own neighborhood, which can lead to those kind of things.
Yeah. And I think it shows our theology and the weak points in our theology when we can dehumanize or demonize, because what we're admitting in doing that is that I actually think where I receive my value from is either my citizenship as an American. I'm valuable because I'm an American citizen and I have the right to be here, or I'm valuable because I hold the right beliefs and vote the correct way. And so if you don't believe like me and vote like me, you are less valuable than me. Or if you do not have the right to be here as an American citizen, you are less valuable than me. And what that betrays is that you don't actually believe in the image of God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You don't actually fully believe that everybody has equal value because God has created each person in the image of God. And that might be blunt and that might be hard to sit with, but it's something we need to wrestle with because God has chosen humans to bear his image, and we need to take that really, really seriously. And kind of the question that this whole conversation leaves me with is actually the reverse question of what we usually ask. We usually ask, how is this thing forming us? And I kind of more want to ask, how did we get here? What formed us to the point where we were able to look at political enemies or immigrants as less than humans? Because I think looking to what has formed us to be able to hold those postures can be informative in helping us to avoid dehumanizing or demonizing in the future. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, historically speaking, immigration is really interesting and complicated in the United States. We even recently, I think we mentioned this before, in the late 90s, early 2000s, under the presidency of George W. Bush, we had a far more laxed immigration policy, even immediately post 9/11. President Obama actually received quite the reputation for being quite the deporter. Someone who he kind of enters in, and he had a much more his administration deported many more immigrants than President Bush's. And what I'm trying to say is, you have a Republican president who had a much more lenient immigration stance than and it's because immigration's been a complicated topic for Americans. Looking purely at American history, when somebody is to say, like, we're a nation of immigrants, that's very true. Historically speaking, we're a very young nation, 300, something 40 years, something like that, in that ballpark, and 350. Anyways, and in that time, we've had over a dozen fairly large voluntary and involuntary immigration events. Many people can take their roots to, I was a part of the Italians who came over, the Germans who came over,
I'm an O'Brien, man.
the Irish, right?
Yeah.
And so, and that's just like a quick kind of snippet, but you enter into a post-World War II era, and America begins to change very rapidly over the next 60 to 70 years. And our immigration policy becomes much more dynamic. But also the world's changing. People are beginning to see America come out of an isolationist mentality, which we had pre-World War II. And it's becoming an even more inviting place in some ways. There's more economic boom. There's more of a viewpoint that America is a place of opportunity. And so we start getting an influx of immigrants, while also our own population is kind of growing, and our infrastructure maybe isn't developing in a way that's really considerate of those coming in. But anyways, so immigration policy becomes a little more complicated, but then you enter into a post 9/11 world. And from my very short-lived experience, that's when immigration truly becomes a toxic conversation in America. And understandably so. There was no, 9/11 just changed America. Like, it opened up our eyes to what could be.
Yeah.
And that changed how we viewed the rest of the world. That changed how we viewed, we just started to view the other as dangerous. There was a season of serious xenophobia against pretty much anybody who even appeared Middle Eastern. I remember that growing up. And that looks different now, but the same basic idea, right? That we now live in a world in which we feel like anybody can be extremely dangerous. And fear is a powerful motivator. And then our politics became a lot more polarized. This is very rambling. I don't know if this is answering any of your question, Nick. But you take that changing, global landscape, right? We now have global terrorism that just looks different than ever. Everyone could be dangerous. Everyone could be a threat. And then you enter into the 2008 crash and economic uncertainty. So now everybody could be a physical threat, but also this is a bunch of adults who are voting who also lived through the economy changed overnight, right? So
there's not enough to go around all of a sudden. Yep.
And suddenly you're living in a scarcity mindset. And so you have humans, like a lot of your voting Americans were alive during 9/11, 2008. Their parents were, baby boomers coming out of the World War II era, living through the Cold War. Just a dangerous world. And so that affects how we come to the immigration policy conversation. And then on top of that, our politics are, I think I could defend this. Our politics are much less intellectual now than ever before. In the advent of social media and the way that public opinion can be communicated, not every 2 years at congressional elections, but every minute, not just what's censored by a 24-hour news cycle, which there's some honestly good to, filtering out, low intellectual thinking, which could sound really arrogant on my part. And I apologize. I don't mean it. I just mean that now anybody with thumbs and a phone, you know what I'm saying?
Any two guys can start a podcast.
Any two guys can start, but I'm such a hypocrite. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has negative consequences. And one of them is the polarization of politics, the simplification of our conversations around politics. And I think that kind of leads to this really toxic immigration environment. So global terrorism, major recession and economic uncertainty, followed up by social media, the advent of thoughts being able to be communicated immediately, the anxiety that comes from that, and the polarization of politics come to that. And then that just puts us all in this big vat of tension.
Yeah. Well, that, and coming off of World War I and even more so World War II, up until the time that we were growing up, especially, American exceptionalism was sky high. I know. Sure. I grew up with this idea that no matter what happens, if there's any war anywhere, America can join and just be the winning side just by being there, right? This idea that anything we do will be successful and victorious. Nobody's army and military can even compare to ours. And so it kind of starts to give you this idea that, A, we are better than other places, B, the world needs us, and without us, they're kind of screwed. And C, like, people in other places are either dangerous or weak or stupid or useless. And so I think all of that combined together certainly had the power to warp our minds and our spirits and our souls. But all of it, I would say, is should be preventable by being actively in pursuit of the way of Jesus. So it's the verse we come back to probably more often than any other, that we should not be conformed to the patterns of this world. We shouldn't be conformed by American exceptionalism and by economic recessions and by 9/11 and terrorist threats. We shouldn't be conformed by those things. We should be transformed by the renewing of our minds, by focusing on the gospel truth that there is enough for everybody in the kingdom to come, that there is no person who is an enemy, because our enemy isn't flesh and blood, but powers and principalities and spiritual forces of darkness. When we focus our minds on these truths and on the goodness and the love of God and on the fact that he has created humans to show us the goodness and the love of God, something happens to our souls that doesn't allow us to be malformed in these ways, that allow us to look down on other people, to think of them as less than us.
And it should lead to actions.
Yes.
That aren't sitting around the Thanksgiving room table telling someone why they're an idiot or why they're a bigot or why they're whatever.
Yeah.
But instead should lead us to a desire to create whatever world of love, safety, and security for our immediate neighbor, for our extended neighbor, geographically extended, I mean, just by space,
Yeah.
And if we let it lead us into action, then I think we're more fulfilling. Somebody said to me today, or I heard in a teaching or something, they just emphasized that Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And he's like, it began with the way. Like, the truth is there. He is the truth, and he is the way. There's a following idea there. Me and my wife are reading through John Mark Comer's new book, which I really do recommend. And The Rule of Life. Wow. Title almost escaped me. No, Practicing the Way. His organization's called Rule of Life.
Yeah.
And the book's called Practicing the Way. So Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer. And we're reading through it. And he, I've heard this before, but it's just so beautiful. He talked about just the idea that, like, disciples of a rabbi, there's this idea of like a metaphor that would be used to eat the dust of your rabbi, that you should walk so closely. Yeah. That when your rabbi was walking on the dirt road, the dust that was kicked up by his sandals, like you should just be covered in that by the end of the day. Yeah. Because you were following so closely behind him. And it's just beautiful. I think often as we're forming our political opinions, we would just be so wise to do you remember like the 90s WWJD?
Oh yeah.
There was good wisdom there,
Yeah.
Like, I had the bracelet and then I spurned the bracelet in my, Jesus is cool and doesn't wear bracelets, age, whatever. Obviously. But I just think, I genuinely think about what would Jesus do a lot. And, if Jesus encountered an undocumented immigrant, how would he act? If Jesus encountered someone who was afraid of those who are illegal inside of our country, how would he act? And he wouldn't demonize or dehumanize any of them. For sure. And so if we're eating his dust, we're walking behind him, we're practicing the way, then we don't get to do that either.
For sure. I do think it's an interesting thought experiment to then say, but what would he advocate for his government to do on behalf of those people? Or would he keep it a wholly separate? I don't know. I have no idea. Oh man,
look, I wrestle with this, and there's no answer. But we'll just say both sides really quick, and maybe that's how we'll wrap. Because I think one side is like he would, on one hand, the kingdom of heaven feels very open borders. Anybody can come.
Yeah, for sure.
On the other hand, there's evidently some strict borders.
Yeah.
And there are those who are cast out.
And it's going to be a safe place.
And yeah, right. And it's going to be a safe place. So, it's complicated, and there's a wisdom that we do not have.
Yeah.
Fully
we didn't
to
get
discern.
To see Jesus live in a democracy.
Yeah, we didn't. And so we don't get the right to judge somebody who came to a different conclusion than us.
Right.
It's complicated. It's nuanced. It's difficult. And, we don't have to come to the right answer.
Right.
We need to live like Jesus, even if we have the wrong one.
Yeah. And I think maybe a summary of if you're not willing to listen to 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks on different ideologies and different policies, I think maybe a summary of all of this is you should have the dust of Jesus's sandals all across your front, rather than the dust of Democratic Party leaders or Republican Party leaders or Fox News or MSNBC or whatever.
Yeah.
So many of us are covered in the wrong dust, not to be too cliche and cheesy, but I think we need to walk closer to Jesus and pay attention to what we're allowing to get inside of us, because it comes out.
Yeah. If your conversations sound more like Sean Hannity or John Oliver, or whatever other I don't know many of them.
Yeah.
Whatever other talking heads are out there. If you sound more like one of them, then you sound like the rabbi that we should be following, Jesus. Then it doesn't really matter what your political stance is. You're already wrong. So. And all of us are in that category in some area. So let's do what we're called to do, which is to repent and to tell the Lord that we are sorry for the way we've acted, for the thoughts that we've had, and to turn away and commit to the best of our ability and with the power of the Spirit to change our thoughts and to change our actions for His glory and His kingdom forever. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for tuning in on this episode of the Living Room Disciple Podcast, as we're wrestling through political topics to understand how we become more like Jesus, not when we vote the exact right way, but when we vote with the right heart. Huge shout out to Eric Church for getting this podcast out into the world, to Micah Pop for making us sound intelligent through amazing production work, and to Daniel Ramirez for his amazing composition. And thank you to you for all of your support and for listening to this episode of the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home.